The ballroom went silent the moment Lady Eleanor Ashworth said the word no for the fourth time that season, and every candle in the room seemed to flicker with the shock of it. Lord Bartholomew Finch stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, his hand still extended, his mouth still open from the question he had just asked in front of 200 guests. He had planned this moment for weeks. He had chosen the music, the timing, even the exact spot beneath the chandelier where the light would catch the ring in his palm. And in one clean breath, Eleanor had taken all of it apart. "I am sorry, my lord," she said, her voice steady, carrying just far enough for the nearest guests to hear. "But I cannot accept." The murmurs began instantly, rising like a wave through the crowd. Fans opened and closed. Someone dropped a glass. Eleanor did not flinch. She simply turned, lifted the hem of her pale blue gown, and walked toward the terrace doors as though she had not just ended a man's evening, his pride, and possibly his standing among his peers. Her mother, the Countess of Ashworth, caught up with her before she reached the cool night air. "Eleanor," her mother's voice was sharp, controlled, the way it always was when she was trying not to scream in public. "Do you understand what you have just done?" "I have refused a man I do not love," Eleanor said simply. "I understood it perfectly." "Love," the Countess said the word as though it tasted bitter. "You think this season is about love. You are 23 years old. Do you know what they call women who refuse every offer at 23? Eleanor did know. She had heard the whispers already, soft and cruel, following her from ballroom to ballroom like a shadow that would not leave. Difficult, proud, strange. Some had even started calling her the girl who says no, as if it were a title she had earned like a duchess or a countess, except this one came with no respect at all, only pity dressed up as gossip. "I would rather be called strange for the rest of my life," Eleanor said, "than spend it married to a man I could never love." Her mother's eyes glistened, not with anger now, but with something closer to fear. "You cannot keep doing this, Eleanor. Every year it becomes harder. Every year there are fewer men willing to try, and more women younger than you filling the ballrooms. You are not being brave. You are being reckless with your own future." Eleanor said nothing. She stepped out onto the terrace and let the night air settle over her shoulders like a second gown, cooler and far more honest than the silk she wore. Behind her, through the tall glass doors, the orchestra began to play again, and the guests slowly returned to their conversations, though she knew every one of them was still talking about her. She had grown used to being talked about. It was easier than most people imagined, once you decided their opinions could not touch the parts of you that mattered. What none of them understood, not her mother, not Lord Finch, not the dozens of women whispering behind painted fans, was the reason behind every refusal. It was not pride. It was not foolishness. It was a memory, 6 years old now, that she had never told a single soul. She had been 17 when she first believed she was in love. His name did not matter anymore, not really, though she still remembered it clearly enough. He had been charming in the way that dangerous things often are, full of soft words and careful attention, the kind that makes a young woman feel as though she has been chosen out of every other woman in the world. She had believed every word. She had let herself hope for a future with him, had imagined a small house, a garden, mornings spent in quiet companionship. Then she had learned, quite by accident, through a letter not meant for her eyes, that he had been courting 2 other young ladies at the very same time, each one believing herself the only one, each one promised the same soft words. Eleanor had been the last to find out, and by the time she did, he had already chosen the wealthiest of the 3, a young lady whose father owned half of Kent. She had not cried in front of anyone. She had learned in that single moment a lesson she never forgot. That charm was often a performance, that soft words could be rehearsed just as easily as a speech, and that a man's attention was not the same as a man's honesty. Since then she had watched every suitor with the same careful eye. She listened not to what they said, but to how they said it. She noticed which men complimented her hair and which men asked about her thoughts. She noticed which men grew impatient when she disagreed with them, and which men simply nodded along, agreeing with everything, saying nothing true at all. Lord Finch had been the third kind, a man so eager to please that he had never once asked what she actually believed about anything. He had complimented her eyes 11 times in a single evening. She had counted. The terrace door opened behind her, and Alina expected her mother again, ready with another lecture about duty and time running out. Instead, she found her father, the Earl of Ashworth, standing quietly in the doorway with his hands folded behind his back. "They are saying you have ruined the family name," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only the faint trace of amusement he rarely allowed himself to show in public. "I am aware, father. Your mother is convinced you will die a lonely old woman surrounded by cats and regret." Alina almost smiled. Mother has always had a talent for drama. The Earl walked to the railing and stood beside her, looking out over the dark garden below, where the hedges were trimmed into perfect, obedient shapes, much like the daughters of London were expected to be. "I will tell you something I have never told your mother," he said quietly. "When I was your age, I nearly married a woman I did not love simply because it was expected of me. My father had arranged it. Everyone approved. She was kind and pretty and entirely wrong for me, and I knew it the moment I looked at her and felt nothing at all." Alina turned to look at him, surprised. Her father rarely spoke of anything so personal. "What happened?" "I broke it off, quietly without scandal, though it took every ounce of courage I had. 2 years later I met your mother, and for all her sharp words tonight, I have never once regretted waiting." He paused. "I am not telling you to wait forever, Alina. I am telling you that a wrong marriage is a far heavier burden than a late one. Does mother know you feel this way?" "Your mother knows a great many things she pretends not to know." He gave her a small, tired smile. "She worries because she loves you, not because she wishes to see you unhappy. Try to remember that, even when her words feel like arrows." Alina nodded, grateful, though the weight in her chest did not lift entirely. She loved her father for his patience, but she knew the truth her mother had spoken was not wrong either. Time was not kind to a woman of her position. Every season brought younger faces, fresher gossip, and fewer chances. She was not foolish enough to believe she could refuse forever without consequence. But she was also not foolish enough to accept a hollow marriage simply to silence the whispers. Inside, the orchestra shifted into a livelier tune, and laughter spilled out through the terrace doors. Alina glanced back into the golden light of the ballroom, at the swirl of silk and jewels and practiced smiles, and felt, as she often did, like an outsider watching a play she had been forced onto the stage of without ever learning her lines. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd and landed, for the smallest moment, on a man she did not recognize. He stood near the far wall, away from the dancing, dressed in dark clothing that seemed almost deliberately plain compared to the peacock colors around him. He was not speaking to anyone. He was simply watching the room, much the way she often did, with an expression that suggested he found the entire spectacle faintly ridiculous. She had never seen him before. London was not so large that new faces went unnoticed, especially not faces that carried themselves with that particular kind of quiet confidence, the sort that did not need to announce itself. "Who is that?" she asked her father, nodding subtly toward the stranger. The Earl followed her gaze and raised an eyebrow. "Ah, that would be the Duke of Marchbrook, Alastair Vane. Surprised to see him here, honestly. The man rarely attends anything. They say he has turned down more invitations in the past 5 years than most men receive in a lifetime." A duke who avoids society. Alina found that curious. Most men of his rank thrived on exactly this kind of attention, collecting admiration the way other men collected fine horses. A duke who avoids society, and who has never once, as far as anyone knows, courted a single woman since inheriting his title. There are rumors, of course. There always are. Something about a broken engagement years ago, though no one seems to know the full truth of it. Her father shrugged. People love a mystery almost as much as they love a scandal, and he has managed to give them neither, which somehow makes them talk about him more. Alina studied the Duke a moment longer. He was not unhandsome, though that was not what caught her attention. It was the stillness of him, the way he seemed entirely unbothered by being watched, entirely unwilling to perform for the room the way every other man tonight had performed for her. As if sensing her gaze, the Duke's eyes lifted and met hers across the distance of the ballroom. For a single heartbeat, neither of them looked away. Then her mother's voice cut through the moment like a blade, calling her back inside to greet some cousin or another, and Alina turned, breaking the connection, telling herself it meant nothing at all. But later that night, lying awake in her bed long after the candles had been snuffed out, she found herself thinking not of Lord Finch, nor of her mother's warnings, nor even of the whispers that would surely follow her into tomorrow's morning calls. She found herself thinking of a pair of steady eyes across a crowded room, and a man who seemed, for reasons she could not explain, entirely unlike every other man she had ever refused. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the same thing 3 more times before sleep finally took her. She was wrong, though she would not understand exactly how wrong for several weeks yet. The next morning brought exactly the storm she had expected. By 10 o'clock, 3 separate callers had already arrived at the Ashworth townhouse, each one eager to discuss the events of the previous evening under the polite disguise of a social visit. By noon, Alina had heard herself described as heartless, as foolish, and from one particularly unkind acquaintance as a woman who clearly enjoyed humiliating good men for sport. She sat through each visit with a calm expression, offering tea, nodding at the appropriate moments, and saying almost nothing at all. It was easier that way. Arguing only fed the fire, and she had long since learned that silence, however uncomfortable, burned out faster than any defense she could offer. Her mother hovered nearby during each visit, her smile brittle, her eyes occasionally flicking to Alina with a mixture of exasperation and worry that never quite faded. It was not until the last caller had gone that the Countess finally sat down across from her daughter, exhaling slowly, as though she had been holding her breath since the previous evening. "You cannot imagine how this looks, Alina." "I imagine it looks exactly as it is. A woman who did not wish to marry a man she does not love." "It looks," her mother said, her voice tightening, "like a young woman who believes she is above the very system that gives her a roof over her head, gowns on her back, and a future at all. Do you think refusing every proposal makes you strong? It makes you talked about. It makes you a cautionary tale mothers use to frighten their daughters into accepting the first respectable offer that comes along." Alina set down her teacup carefully, choosing her words with the same care. "Would you rather I marry a man I do not love, simply to stop being talked about?" Her mother's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alina thought she saw something flicker behind her mother's eyes, something that looked almost like understanding, quickly buried beneath years of practiced composure. "I would rather," her mother said finally, quietly, "that you not throw away every chance you have in the hope of finding something that may never come." The words lingered in the room long after her mother had risen and left, and Alina sat alone with her cooling tea, staring out the window at the gray London sky, wondering, not for the first time, whether her mother might be right. She thought again, without quite meaning to, of a pair of steady dark eyes across a crowded ballroom, and a man who had not once looked away. She told herself firmly that it meant nothing. By the end of that week, she would already know how wrong she was. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked among a stack of ordinary correspondence, and Alina nearly missed it entirely. It was only the weight of the paper, thick and cream-colored, that made her pause and set aside the letter she had been reading. She turned it over and saw the seal pressed into the wax, a crest she recognized instantly from her father's description days earlier. The Duke of Marchbrook was hosting a small gathering at his townhouse, a dinner for a limited number of guests, and somehow, inexplicably, the Ashworth family had been included. "He never hosts anything," her mother said, reading over Alina's shoulder with barely concealed astonishment. "Not once in 5 years. Why on earth would he begin now?" Alina had no answer, though a small, unfamiliar flutter moved through her chest at the thought of seeing those steady dark eyes again. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more, the same curiosity anyone might feel toward a mystery that had suddenly, unexpectedly, opened its door. The evening of the dinner arrived with a light rain falling over London, softening the gas lamps into hazy gold circles along the street. Elinor dressed carefully, though not extravagantly, choosing a gown of deep green that her mother had once called too plain for a woman trying to attract a husband. Elinor had never been trying to attract a husband. She had simply always liked the color. The Duke's townhouse was smaller than she expected, elegant but understated, without the excessive gilding and ornamentation so many of the grand London houses seemed to compete over. The rooms were warm, lit by fire rather than by rows of candles, and the guest list, she quickly realized, was far shorter than any ball she had attended that season. Perhaps 20 people in total, gathered in a comfortable drawing room before dinner, speaking in the kind of low, easy conversation that large parties never seemed to allow. She spotted the Duke near the fireplace, speaking with an older gentleman she did not recognize. He wore dark blue this evening, simple in cut but clearly well made, and when his eyes lifted and found hers across the room, there was no flicker of surprise in them, only a quiet acknowledgement, as though he had known exactly where she would be standing. Dinner passed pleasantly enough, filled with the usual polite conversation about the weather, the state of the roads, and a recent scandal involving a baron's youngest son that everyone seemed eager to discuss without actually saying anything true about it. Elinor found herself seated some distance from the Duke, close enough to observe him but too far to speak with him directly, and she spent most of the meal watching him rather than participating fully in the conversation around her. He did not dominate the table the way many men of his rank tended to do. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was usually to ask a question rather than deliver an opinion. She noticed he asked the older gentleman beside him detailed questions about a recent agricultural innovation, listening with genuine attention to answers that clearly interested him rather than nodding along out of politeness. It was not until after dinner, when the guests moved back into the drawing room and the conversation broke into smaller groups, that Elinor found herself, quite by accident, standing near a set of glass doors that led out to a small private garden. She had stepped away from a conversation about upcoming weddings that she had no interest in continuing, and had not realized anyone else had followed until a voice spoke quietly behind her. "You look as though you would rather be discussing anything else." Elinor turned, startled, to find the Duke standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, an expression on his face that was not quite a smile, but held something close to amusement. "Was it that obvious, Your Grace?" Only to someone who has spent a great many evenings feeling exactly the same way. He nodded toward the garden beyond the glass. "Would you care to walk? It is a small garden, nothing impressive, but it is quieter than in here." She hesitated only a moment before agreeing, and he led her out through the doors into the cool evening air, where the rain had stopped and the clouds had begun to thin, revealing patches of stars above the city glow. They walked in silence for a moment, and Elinor found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the silence did not feel uncomfortable. Most men filled every quiet moment with words, as though silence itself was a failure to be avoided. The Duke seemed content to simply walk, unhurried, as though there was nowhere else in the world he needed to be. "I understand congratulations are in order," he said finally, and there was something dry in his tone that made Elinor glance at him sharply. "Or perhaps commiserations. I confess I am not entirely certain which is appropriate, given the circumstances." "You have heard about Lord Finch, then?" "Everyone in London has heard about Lord Finch. I believe there are children in the countryside who have heard about Lord Finch by now." He said it without malice, and Elinor found herself, unexpectedly, fighting back a laugh. "I did not humiliate him on purpose," she said. "I simply could not bring myself to lie to him in front of 200 people." "That," the Duke said, "is precisely why I find myself rather more interested in your company than in most of the drawing room behind us." Elinor turned to look at him fully, caught off guard by the directness of the statement. Most men spoke around their intentions, wrapping them in careful compliments about her appearance or her grace. The Duke had simply said what he meant. You find refusing a proposal in public interesting. I find honesty rare enough that I notice it wherever it appears. He stopped walking, and she stopped beside him, near a small stone bench beneath a bare autumn tree. I have spent a great many years watching this city perform for itself, Lady Eleanor. Everyone smiles at everyone. Everyone agrees with everyone. And underneath all of it, almost no one says what they actually think, because saying what you think is dangerous, and this city does not reward danger. And yet you never attend anything, Eleanor said. My father tells me you have refused more invitations than most men receive. I have little patience for performances I do not wish to watch. Then why host one tonight? For the first time since she had met him, the Duke seemed to hesitate, choosing his words with visible care. I wish to see whether the woman across that ballroom was as interesting up close as she appeared from a distance. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar and unwelcome, and she looked away toward the dark shape of the garden hedges, unsure how to respond to a compliment that was not really a compliment at all, but something closer to an honest observation. And what have you concluded, Your Grace? That I was correct to be curious. He said it simply, without flourish, and somehow that made it land with far more weight than any of Lord Finch's 11 compliments about her eyes ever had. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the cold air settling between them, before the Duke spoke again, his tone shifting into something more practical. I have a matter I have been wrestling with, regarding one of my estates in the north. My steward believes we should convert a portion of the tenant farmland to a newer method of crop rotation, one that requires significant investment now for uncertain gain later. I confess I do not entirely trust his numbers, though I cannot say precisely why. He glanced at her. You strike me as someone who thinks carefully before speaking. I would value your opinion if you are willing to give it. Eleanor blinked, genuinely surprised. In 4 years of London seasons, across dozens of conversations with dozens of suitors, not a single man had ever asked her opinion on a matter of actual consequence. She had been asked about music, about fashion, about her preferences in flowers and poetry, but never once about land, or numbers, or decisions that mattered. You wish my opinion on estate management. I wish the opinion of someone who does not simply tell me what I want to hear. There was no teasing in his voice now, only sincerity. I have found that most people, when asked for advice, are far more interested in appearing agreeable than in being useful. Eleanor considered the question seriously, drawing on what little she knew from listening to her father's conversations with his own steward over the years. Conversations she had absorbed quietly from the edges of rooms where she was not expected to be paying attention. What troubles me, she said slowly, is not the investment itself, but whether your steward has accounted for a poor harvest year during the transition. New methods often promise greater yield eventually, but if the numbers assume every season goes well and one does not, your tenants could suffer greatly in the meantime, and suffering tenants rarely forgive quickly. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. That, he said finally, is precisely the flaw I could not name myself, though I sensed it was there. He shook his head slightly, something like genuine admiration crossing his features. My steward assured me the numbers were sound. He did not once mention the risk to the tenants themselves. Numbers rarely account for people, Your Grace. That is usually left to someone else. And you thought of it immediately, without hesitation. I have spent a great deal of time listening at the edges of rooms, Eleanor admitted. It is remarkable what men will say freely when they believe no one of consequence is paying attention. The Duke laughed then, a real laugh, low and unguarded, and the sound of it surprised them both. He seemed, for a moment, almost younger than he had appeared across the ballroom days earlier, less like a distant figure of rumor and more like a man genuinely enjoying a conversation for the first time in a long while. I begin to think, Lady Eleanor, that London has been asking you the wrong questions. She looked at him, something shifting quietly in her chest, a warmth she did not entirely trust but could not quite deny either. Perhaps London has simply never known which questions to ask. Then allow me to ask a better one. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious now, though not unkind. Not tonight. Tonight I have already taken enough of your time, and your mother is likely watching this garden through the glass with growing alarm. A faint smile touched his mouth. But soon, if you would permit it, I would like to ask you something no one else appears to have bothered asking. Eleanor's heart beat a little faster, though she could not have said exactly why. And what question is that, your grace? Patience, my lady. His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, the same way they had across the ballroom days before. Some questions deserve better timing than a cold garden and a worried mother. They returned to the drawing room shortly after, and Eleanor spent the remainder of the evening only half listening to the conversation swirling around her, her mind circling back again and again to the Duke's words, to the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having been truly listened to, perhaps for the first time in her adult life. Her mother cornered her the moment their carriage pulled away from the townhouse, questions spilling out faster than Eleanor could answer them. What had they discussed? How long had they walked in the garden? Had he said anything of significance? Eleanor answered as vaguely as she could manage, unwilling to share the strange, fragile thing that had begun to grow in her chest, unwilling to risk her mother's excitement turning it into another performance, another expectation, another weight she was not yet ready to carry. That night, lying in the dark long after the house had gone quiet, Eleanor found herself thinking not of the whispers that had followed her since Lord Finch's failed proposal, nor of her mother's warnings about time running short. She thought instead of a quiet garden, a serious question left deliberately unasked, and a man who had looked at her not as a prize to be won, but as a person worth actually knowing. For the first time in 6 years, since a folded letter not meant for her eyes had taught her not to trust soft words, Eleanor allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. She did not yet know how much that hope would be tested in the weeks ahead, nor how close she would come to losing it entirely before she ever heard the question the Duke had promised to ask. 3 weeks passed before Eleanor saw the Duke again, and in that time London seemed determined to test every ounce of patience she had left. The whispers about Lord Finch had not faded as quickly as she had hoped. If anything, they had grown sharper, twisted through countless retellings until she barely recognized her own actions in the stories being passed from parlor to parlor. In one version, she had laughed in his face. In another, she had called him unworthy in front of the entire ballroom. She heard both versions from different acquaintances within the same week, each one delivered with the same false sympathy, the same barely hidden delight at her supposed downfall. Her mother's anxiety had not eased either. If anything, the invitation to the Duke's dinner had only sharpened it, turning worry into something closer to desperate hope, a hope Eleanor found almost harder to bear than the earlier disappointment. "You must be careful," her mother said one morning, over a breakfast neither of them was truly eating. "A duke who has avoided courtship for 5 years does not simply change his habits without reason. Do not let yourself believe in something before it has been properly offered." "I have not believed in anything, mother," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. "Good," her mother said, though her eyes lingered on Eleanor a moment longer than necessary, as though she could see straight through the careful composure her daughter wore like armor. The truth was, Eleanor had thought of little else besides that quiet garden conversation. She had turned the Duke's words over in her mind so many times that she had begun to worry she was inventing meaning where none existed, reading significance into a moment that had likely meant far less to him than it had meant to her. Dukes did not marry for the reasons ordinary people imagined. They married for alliances, for land, for heirs. And while Alistair Vane had seemed genuinely interested in her opinion on tenant farming, genuine interest in a conversation was not the same as genuine interest in a wife. She told herself this firmly, several times a day, and found it did remarkably little to quiet the small, persistent hope that had taken root in her chest since that cold evening in his garden. It was at a garden party hosted by Lady Pembroke, held on one of the last warm afternoons before autumn fully surrendered to winter, that Elinor saw the Duke again. She had not expected him to attend, given everything she had heard about his reluctance for social gatherings, and the sight of him standing near the rose beds, speaking quietly with Lord Pembroke, sent an unexpected jolt of warmth through her chest. He noticed her almost immediately, excusing himself from his conversation with a politeness that did not invite argument, and crossed the lawn toward her with the same unhurried confidence she remembered from their walk in his garden. "Lady Elinor," he inclined his head slightly, "I confess I did not expect the pleasure of your company today." "Nor I yours, your grace. I understood garden parties fell rather low on your list of tolerable events." "They do," he admitted, a faint smile touching his mouth. "Though I find my tolerance for such things has improved considerably in recent weeks." Elinor felt heat rise in her cheeks and glanced away toward the roses, unwilling to let him see quite how much that simple statement affected her. Around them, other guests had already begun to notice, heads turning subtly, conversations pausing mid-sentence as the sight of the reclusive Duke speaking so openly with Lady Elinor Ashworth registered across the lawn like a spark catching dry grass. "We are being watched," she murmured. "We are always being watched," the Duke replied, unbothered. "I find it easier simply to stop noticing." He offered his arm, an invitation rather than a command. "Would you walk with me? There is a path near the far hedges that offers considerably less audience." She accepted, and they walked together across the lawn, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the fabric of his coat warm beneath her fingers despite the coolness of the afternoon air. Behind them, she could feel the weight of curious eyes, could imagine already the conversations that would spread through London by evening. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found she did not particularly care. "I have thought a great deal about our conversation," the Duke said once they had put enough distance between themselves and the main gathering. "About the tenant farms. Have your steward's numbers improved, then?" "Considerably. Once I insisted he account for a poor harvest year, exactly as you suggested." He glanced at her, something like genuine respect in his expression. "You saved my tenants a great deal of hardship, Lady Elinor, and saved me from a decision I would have deeply regretted." "I am glad to have been of use, your grace, though I confess I did very little beyond ask an obvious question." "It was not obvious to anyone else who reviewed those numbers, myself included." He shook his head slightly. "I have employed that steward for 6 years. He is competent, hardworking, and entirely too focused on projected profit to consider the people the profit depends upon." "You saw the flaw within minutes." Elinor said nothing, though warmth spread through her chest at the sincerity in his voice. It was such a small thing, being taken seriously, being trusted with a real problem, and having her answer valued rather than dismissed. And yet it felt, somehow, like the largest thing anyone had offered her in years. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past the hedges Lady Pembroke had trimmed into elaborate shapes, past a small ornamental pond where a pair of swans drifted lazily across still water. The Duke seemed content, as he had been in his own garden, to let silence exist between them without rushing to fill it, and Elinor found herself, once again, grateful for the ease of it. "May I ask you something personal, Lady Elinor?" the Duke said eventually, his tone careful, as though testing whether the question would be welcome. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer." "Fair enough." He paused, choosing his words. "Everyone in London seems to have a theory about why you refuse every proposal offered to you. I have heard perhaps a dozen different explanations, each one more elaborate than the last. I find myself curious what the true reason is, if you are willing to share it." Elinor's step slowed, and for a moment she considered deflecting the question, offering some polite, vague answer the way she had done with every other person who had asked some version of the same thing over the past weeks. But something about the directness of his gaze, the genuine curiosity in his voice rather than judgment, made her hesitate before the deflection could form. "I was 17, she said finally, quietly, surprising herself with the admission. I believed myself in love with a man who turned out to be courting two other women at the same time, each of us believing ourselves the only one. I learned the truth by accident, through a letter that was never meant for my eyes. The Duke's expression did not shift into pity, which she was grateful for. It shifted instead into something quieter, more thoughtful. That is not an easy thing to recover from. I am not certain I have recovered from it, not entirely, but it taught me something I have never forgotten. Charm can be rehearsed. Soft words can be performed. I decided after that I would rather remain unmarried than spend my life uncertain whether a man's attention was genuine or simply well practiced. And every man since has failed that particular test. Every man since has failed to even understand there was a test, Elinor said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only tired honesty. Lord Finch complimented my eyes 11 times in a single evening. I counted. Not once did he ask what I thought about anything of substance. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was low, careful, entirely without performance. I cannot promise you certainty, Lady Elinor. I do not think anyone honestly can, no matter how sincere their words. But I can promise you I have no interest in reciting compliments I do not mean, nor in performing affection I do not feel. If I ask you a question, it will be because I genuinely wish to know the answer, not because it is the question a man in my position is expected to ask. Elinor looked at him, something in her chest tightening with a feeling she was not yet ready to name. You said in your garden that you had a question you wished to ask when the timing was better. I did say that. Is the timing better now? The Duke stopped walking, and Elinor stopped beside him, near the edge of the pond where the swans continued their slow, unbothered circles. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious, and for a moment she thought perhaps he would ask it right there, beneath the pale autumn sky, with Lady Pembroke's guests still murmuring somewhere behind them. Instead, he shook his head slightly, a rueful smile touching his mouth. Not quite. I find I would rather ask it somewhere with considerably fewer swans as witnesses, and considerably less risk of your mother appearing over that hedge to interrupt us. Elinor laughed genuinely, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. It had been a long time since she had laughed so easily with anyone, longer still since a man's company had felt this comfortable, this free of performance. You are remarkably patient, Your Grace, for a man who claims to dislike waiting. I have waited 5 years to feel anything close to what I am feeling now, Lady Elinor. A few more weeks will not undo me. The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold winter, and she found herself, for the first time since that folded letter had taught her the danger of soft words, genuinely, cautiously, willing to believe them. They returned to the main gathering shortly after, and the whispers that followed them across the lawn were louder now, more insistent. But Elinor found she could face them with something closer to quiet confidence than the dread she had felt weeks earlier. Whatever this was, whatever careful, patient thing was building between herself and the reclusive Duke of Marchbrook, it felt different from anything London had offered her before. It was only later that evening, once she had returned home and settled into the quiet of her own room, that a small note arrived by messenger, delivered directly to her rather than through the usual channel of her mother's correspondence. She unfolded it with careful fingers and found only a single line, written in a steady, unhurried hand. Thank you for a conversation I will not soon forget. Until we meet again, A.V. Elinor read it 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into the drawer of her writing desk, beside nothing else, a small private thing that belonged only to her. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps not every soft word was a performance after all. She did not yet know that the past she had buried so carefully, the memory of a folded letter and a broken promise, was about to resurface in a way she could never have anticipated, nor that the Duke's own guarded history carried shadows every bit as heavy as her own. The question came on a Thursday evening, in a place Elinor never expected. She had been invited, along with her parents, to a small musical evening hosted by an elderly cousin of her mother's, the kind of gathering usually filled with mediocre pianoforte performances and an excess of lukewarm tea. Elinor had attended out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, and had resigned herself to an unremarkable evening long before their carriage arrived. She had not expected the Duke to be among the guests. He stood near the back of the room, away from the small crowd gathered around the pianoforte, and when Elinor spotted him, her heart gave an unexpected lift that she was quickly learning to recognize and quietly dread. Dread not because the feeling itself was unwelcome, but because she had spent 6 years training herself against exactly this kind of hope, and it seemed, despite every careful defense she had built, entirely unwilling to listen. "I did not realize you were acquainted with my mother's cousin," she said quietly, once she had made her way to his side during a pause between performances. "I am not," the Duke admitted. "I asked a mutual acquaintance to secure me an invitation once I learned you would be attending." Elinor blinked, caught off guard by the plainness of the admission. "You attended a musical evening you had no connection to, simply because I would be here. I told you once that I have little patience for performances I do not wish to watch." His eyes held hers, steady and warm. "This particular performance, however, I found myself quite willing to sit through." A young lady at the pianoforte began a rather ambitious rendition of a piece clearly beyond her skill, and the Duke offered his arm with a small, private smile. "Shall we find somewhere quieter to suffer through this?" They stepped out into a narrow hallway lined with portraits of relatives Elinor had never met, the muffled sound of the pianoforte fading behind them into something almost tolerable. The Duke led her toward a small alcove near a tall window, where moonlight spilled across the floor in pale, silver ribbons. "I have been thinking a great deal about patience these past weeks," he said, turning to face her fully. "About timing and about waiting for the right moment, and I have come to a rather inconvenient conclusion." "And what conclusion is that, Your Grace?" "That there is no perfect moment. There is only the moment you have, and the choice of whether to use it or let it pass." He took a small breath, and for the first time since she had met him, Elinor saw something like nervousness cross his composed features. "I promised you a question, weeks ago, and I find I can no longer wait for a garden free of witnesses or a lawn free of swans." Elinor's heart beat quickly now, and she said nothing, waiting, watching him with an attention she had never given anyone before. "What do you actually want, Lady Elinor?" he asked quietly. "Not what your mother wants for you. Not what society expects of a woman your age, your position, your reputation. Not even what you believe you are supposed to want, after years of being told what a good marriage should look like. I am asking what you yourself truly want, separate from every voice that has ever told you otherwise." The question landed with a weight Elinor had not anticipated, settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that reached places she had not examined in years, perhaps ever. She opened her mouth to answer, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she did not immediately know how. No suitor had ever asked her this. Lord Finch had asked whether she found his estate agreeable. The Viscount before him had asked whether she preferred London or the countryside, clearly hoping her answer would align conveniently with his own properties. Every question she had been asked across 4 seasons had been designed, whether consciously or not, to determine her suitability, her preferences as they related to a life someone else had already planned around her. No one had ever asked what she wanted, entirely and simply, for its own sake. "I do not know," she admitted finally, quietly, the honesty of it startling even herself. "I have spent so many years learning what I do not want, learning to recognize false charm and empty compliments, that I am not certain I have ever truly considered what I do want, beyond simply avoiding what I fear." The Duke did not seem disappointed by the answer. If anything, something in his expression softened, as though her uncertainty was itself a kind of honesty he had been hoping for. "Then perhaps," he said gently, "that is a question worth taking your time with. I am not asking for an answer tonight, Lady Elinor. I am asking you to begin considering it truly, without the noise of everyone else's expectations drowning out your own voice. Why does it matter to you? She asked, genuinely curious. Most men in your position would simply wish for a suitable wife, agreeable and accomplished, without concerning themselves with what she actually wants beyond that. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the pale moonlight falling across the London rooftops beyond the glass. "Because I made that mistake myself once," he said finally, his voice lower now, carrying something heavier beneath it. "Years ago, I was engaged to a woman I believed I loved, and I never once asked her what she truly wanted because I was too consumed with what I wanted our future to look like. I assumed her happiness would follow naturally from mine, the way water follows the shape of whatever container holds it. What happened? She left 3 weeks before our wedding with a letter explaining that she had never once felt asked, only told, that she had spent our entire engagement performing contentment because I had never given her room to be anything else." He turned back to face Alina, something raw and honest in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "I did not understand at the time how deeply I had failed her. It took years, and a great deal of solitude, before I understood that love without genuine curiosity about the other person is simply a very comfortable kind of selfishness." Alina stared at him, something shifting quietly in her chest, a recognition she had not expected to find in a Duke who seemed, on the surface, to have everything a person could want. "That is why you avoid society," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "Not because you dislike people, but because you were afraid of repeating the same mistake." "Precisely." He gave a small, tired smile. "It is remarkably easier to avoid failing someone when you avoid attempting anything at all. I told myself for 5 years that solitude was simply my preference. It took a woman refusing a proposal in front of 200 people to remind me that avoiding failure is not the same thing as living well." Alina felt something warm and fragile bloom in her chest, a recognition of shared wounds carried differently but no less deeply, a sense that perhaps, for the first time, she was speaking with someone who understood exactly why she had built the defenses she had. "I do not know what I want yet," she said again, more softly this time, "but I find standing here that I want to know. I want to actually discover the answer, rather than simply avoiding every question that might lead me toward disappointment." "That," the Duke said, something like relief and hope mingling in his voice, "is precisely the answer I was hoping to hear, even though it was not the answer to the question itself." They stood together in the quiet alcove for a long moment, the muffled sound of the pianoforte drifting faintly from the room beyond, moonlight pooling silver across the floor between them. Alina felt, standing there, something she had not felt in 6 years. The fragile, terrifying possibility of trust, offered not through performance or practiced charm, but through the simple, uncommon act of being genuinely asked. "I should return before my absence is noticed," she said eventually, though she found she was reluctant to move. "As should I before your mother sends a search party through the hallways." The Duke offered his arm again, and as they walked back toward the sound of music and polite conversation, he added quietly, "Take whatever time you need, Lady Alina. I find I am, against every habit I have built over 5 years, entirely willing to wait for an honest answer, rather than rush toward a convenient one." Alina returned to the musical evening with her composure carefully restored, though her mind remained entirely elsewhere, circling the Duke's question like a compass needle that had finally found true north after years of spinning uselessly. What did she want? The question followed her home that night, followed her into sleep and into the quiet hours of the following morning, and she found, turning it over again and again, that she was beginning, slowly and cautiously, to find pieces of an answer she had never allowed herself to search for before. She did not yet know that the search would soon be interrupted by a ghost from her own past, one that would test not only her growing trust in the Duke, but her trust in herself. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, and the moment Alina recognized the handwriting on the envelope, her stomach dropped in a way she had not felt in 6 years. She had not seen that handwriting since she was 17 years old, since the day she had discovered, through a letter never meant for her eyes, exactly how little her first love had valued her trust. She had convinced herself over the years that she would never need to think of him again, that the wound had closed even if the scar remained. Seeing his name now, written across the front of an envelope addressed directly to her, felt like discovering the scar had never fully healed at all. She carried the letter to her room before opening it, her hands unsteady in a way she despised, and read the contents twice before she fully understood what she was looking at. His name was Edmund Caro, and he had, apparently, returned to London after several years abroad, having recently inherited a modest estate following the death of an uncle. The letter was polite, almost painfully so, expressing hope that she might permit him to call upon her, to offer, as he put it, a long overdue apology for the pain he had caused her as a very young and very foolish man. Elinor sat with the letter for a long time, staring at words she had never expected to receive, feeling old wounds stir uncomfortably beneath skin she had believed long since healed. She did not respond immediately. She told no one, not her mother, not her father, and certainly not the Duke, though the temptation to seek his steady, honest perspective pulled at her more than once over the following days. Instead, she carried the weight of it privately, turning it over in her mind alongside the question the Duke had given her weeks earlier, the two burdens tangling together until she could barely separate one from the other. What do you actually want, Lady Elinor? How could she possibly know what she wanted, when the past she thought she had buried had just knocked, quite literally, on her front door? It was nearly a week later, at a small gathering hosted by one of her mother's acquaintances, that Edmund Caro appeared in person, and Elinor found herself face to face with the man who had, 6 years earlier, taught her to distrust every soft word a man had ever offered her since. He looked older, of course, though not unhandsome, his features carrying a maturity they had lacked at 20. He approached her with visible caution, as though aware he had no right to expect a warm reception, and Elinor found herself, despite everything, curious to hear what he might say. "Lady Elinor," he said, bowing slightly, "I did not expect to see you here, though I confess I had hoped for the opportunity." "Mr. Caro," her voice came out steadier than she felt, "I received your letter. I would not have blamed you for burning it unread." A faint, self-deprecating smile touched his mouth. "I have thought of you often over the years, Elinor, and of how poorly I treated your trust. I was young and vain, and entirely too pleased with my own charm to consider the harm it caused. I have spent a great deal of time since then regretting it." Elinor studied him carefully, searching for the practiced performance she had learned to recognize so well, and found, to her genuine surprise, that his words carried a weight that felt uncomfortably close to sincerity. "Why now?" she asked. 6 years is a long time to wait for an apology. I only recently returned to London, and I confess, when I heard you had never married, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps—" He trailed off, seeming to reconsider his words. "I do not wish to presume. I only wish to apologize properly, and to tell you honestly that the 2 other women I courted at the time meant nothing compared to what I felt for you. I was simply too cowardly, at 20, to choose the harder path of honesty over the easier path of avoiding difficult conversations." Elinor felt something complicated stir in her chest, an old ache mixed uncomfortably with something almost like validation, the strange relief of finally hearing the man who had hurt her acknowledge that hurt directly, after years of silence. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Caro, truly, but I am not certain what you hope to gain by offering it now." "Perhaps nothing," he admitted. "Perhaps only the chance to correct, in some small way, the harm I caused. But I would be lying if I said I did not also hope, given time, that you might allow me the opportunity to prove I have changed." Elinor did not answer immediately, and their conversation was interrupted shortly after by the arrival of other guests, leaving her with far more questions than the peace she had hoped an apology might bring. Word traveled quickly through London, as it always did, and within days, whispers had begun circulating about Elinor Ashworth's mysterious former suitor, returned from abroad, apparently seeking to rekindle a connection from years past. The whispers reached the Duke, as Alina had known they eventually would, and he called upon her townhouse the following afternoon with an expression more guarded than she had seen since the earliest days of their acquaintance. "I understand there is a Mr. Caro recently returned to London," he said, once they had found a moment of privacy in the small sitting room, her mother hovering diplomatically nearby, but out of earshot. "I understand he has expressed some interest in renewing an old acquaintance." Alina studied the careful neutrality in his tone, recognizing beneath it something she had not expected to see from him. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear, though he was working hard to conceal it. "He was the man I told you about," she said quietly, "in your garden. The one whose letter taught me not to trust soft words." Something shifted behind the Duke's eyes, understanding and concern mingling together. "And now he has returned, offering an apology." "He has? Do you believe him?" Alina considered the question carefully, aware of how much weight it carried, aware that her answer would reveal something significant not only about Edmund Caro, but about her own growing feelings for the man sitting across from her now. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "Part of me wishes to believe people can change, that 6 years is enough time for a foolish young man to become an honest one. And part of me remembers exactly how convincing his charm once was, and wonders whether I am simply being deceived a second time by the same practiced performance." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the possessiveness or jealousy she had half expected, only careful, measured honesty. "I cannot tell you what to believe, Alina. I will not insult you by pretending his return does not concern me, because it does. But I will not ask you to dismiss him simply to ease my own uncertainty. You deserve to make that judgment for yourself, with clear eyes, not because I have asked it of you." Alina looked at him, something warm and grateful moving through her chest despite the tangled uncertainty of the past week. Here again was the same quality that had drawn her to him from the very beginning: his refusal to perform, his insistence on honesty even when honesty was inconvenient, even when a simpler man might have simply demanded she refuse Edmund Caro outright. "You are not going to ask me to refuse to see him." "I have no right to ask that of you," the Duke said. "Nor would I wish to. If I asked you to choose between us before you have had the chance to understand your own feelings clearly, I would be guilty of exactly the mistake I made with my previous engagement. I would be asking you to perform certainty for my comfort, rather than allowing you the space to discover it honestly." "You are remarkably patient, Your Grace." "I am remarkably terrified," he corrected, with a small, rueful smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "But terror does not give me the right to rush you toward a decision that is not truly yours." Alina reached across the small distance between them and, in a gesture that surprised them both, took his hand gently in hers. "I do not need time to determine which of you speaks with more honesty, Alistair. I have known that answer since the moment you asked what I actually wanted, rather than what I was expected to want." Something eased visibly in the Duke's shoulders, though the concern in his eyes did not fully disappear. "Then why do I sense there is more uncertainty in you than you are admitting?" Alina sighed, the honesty of the observation settling over her. "Because 6 years of caution do not disappear simply because I have found one man I believe to be genuine. Some part of me still fears I am wrong about you the same way I was once wrong about him. It is not you I distrust, Alistair. It is my own judgment." The Duke's expression softened entirely then, and he lifted her hand gently, pressing a brief, careful kiss to her fingers, a gesture far more restrained than the swelling emotion Alina could see plainly in his eyes. "Then take whatever time your judgment requires," he said quietly. "I would rather wait 100 cautious weeks for a certain answer than rush toward an uncertain one in a single afternoon." Alina left their conversation that day with her chest full of conflicting emotions. Gratitude and affection tangled uncomfortably alongside old fears that refused to fully release their grip. Over the following days, she agreed, cautiously, to a single supervised visit from Edmund Caro, determined to test her own judgment properly rather than simply avoiding the question entirely. The visit revealed, slowly and carefully, cracks in Edmund's carefully constructed apology. He spoke beautifully of regret, but grew visibly uncomfortable whenever Alina asked specific questions about the estate he had inherited, about his plans for the future, about anything that required more than polished sentiment. When she asked directly whether his sudden interest in reconnecting was influenced at all by the rumors of her growing connection to a duke, his hesitation before answering told her everything his words tried to deny. By the end of the visit, Alina understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that Edmund Caro's apology, however sincerely felt in the moment, was built on the same foundation as his charm 6 years earlier. A talent for saying exactly what a listener wished to hear, without the substance beneath it to support the words. She wrote to him that evening, thanking him for his apology, accepting it with genuine grace, and informing him gently but firmly that she wished him well, though she had no interest in renewing any connection beyond simple civility. The relief that followed was immense, though it was accompanied by something else entirely. A growing, undeniable certainty about the answer to the Duke's question, one she found herself eager, for the first time in 6 years, to share. The weeks that followed Edmund Caro's departure from her life brought a kind of quiet Alina had not experienced in a very long time, a settling of old ghosts that allowed her, for the first time, to turn her full attention toward the future rather than constantly guarding against the past. She and the Duke began meeting regularly, though never in ways that drew undue scandal. He called upon her townhouse twice weekly, always with her mother present in some capacity, though the Countess had grown considerably less anxious in her supervision as the weeks passed, watching her daughter's growing ease with the Duke with an expression that mixed relief with something close to wonder. They exchanged letters between visits, brief notes that had little to do with romance and everything to do with genuine curiosity. His thoughts on a book she had recommended, her opinion on a decision he faced regarding a tenant dispute, small fragments of daily life exchanged with an honesty neither of them had offered anyone else before. It was in these small exchanges, rather than any grand gesture, that Alina found herself falling in love, slowly and without the dizzying uncertainty she had once associated with the word. This was not the breathless, performative romance she had believed herself to feel at 17. It was steadier, built on the accumulation of 100 small honesties rather than a single sweeping declaration, and precisely because of that steadiness, she trusted it far more. One afternoon in early winter, as the first frost settled over London's gardens, the Duke arrived at the Ashworth townhouse with an unusual request. "I would like you to see Marchbrook," he said, once they had settled into the drawing-room, her mother occupied nearby with needlework she was clearly using as an excuse to remain within earshot. "The estate itself, not simply stories of it. I find I would value your opinion on the place that has been my home for most of my life." "You wish me to visit your estate?" "With your parents, of course, and a proper chaperone throughout." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I am not proposing anything improper, Alina. I am proposing that if we are to continue building whatever this is between us, you should see the place, and the people that come with it. I would not wish you to discover, after any commitment was made, that Marchbrook was not what you had imagined." Alina appreciated the honesty of the invitation, the same careful consideration he had shown her from the very beginning, and she agreed readily, curious to see the estate that had shaped so much of who he had become. The journey north took the better part of 2 days, and Alina found herself, despite her attempts at composure, growing increasingly nervous as their carriage finally turned up the long drive toward Marchbrook itself. The house rose before them in the pale winter light, grand but not overwhelming, built of pale gray stone softened by ivy that had clearly been allowed to grow wild rather than trimmed into rigid submission, much like the gardens surrounding it. "It is beautiful," Alina said quietly as their carriage drew closer. "It is home," the Duke replied simply, and there was something in his voice, some deep, quiet affection, that told her more about the man beside her than any grand declaration could have. The following days passed in a comfortable rhythm of exploration and conversation. The Duke showed her the estate not as a proud landowner displaying his wealth, but as someone genuinely eager to share the place he loved with someone whose opinion he valued. He introduced her to his tenants, and Alina watched with growing admiration how genuinely he knew each family, their concerns, their circumstances, far beyond what mere obligation would require. "You truly know them," she said, after one particular visit to a tenant family whose eldest son had recently taken ill, the Duke having personally arranged for a physician's visit without being asked. "They are not simply names on a rent ledger to me," he said. "My father taught me that a title without responsibility is simply vanity wearing expensive clothing. I have tried, imperfectly, to remember that lesson." It was during a quiet walk through the estate's winter gardens, 3 days into their visit, that Alina finally found the words she had been searching for since the night of the musical evening, weeks earlier. "You asked me once what I wanted," she said, as they walked beneath bare trees, their breath visible in the cold air. "I did not have an answer then. I believe I have one now." The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying the same careful attention he always gave her, as though nothing else in the world existed beyond whatever she was about to say. "I want," Alina said slowly, choosing each word with care, "a life built on honesty rather than performance. I want a partner who asks my opinion because he genuinely values it, not because it is expected of him. I want to be seen, not simply admired, and I want to see clearly in return without the fear that soft words might be hiding something less honest beneath them." She paused, meeting his eyes steadily. "I believe I have found all of that, Alistair, in you." The Duke's composure, usually so steady, cracked visibly at her words, something raw and hopeful breaking through the careful reserve he had maintained since the very beginning of their acquaintance. Alina, her name, spoken with such quiet reverence, sent warmth through her entire chest. "I have spent 5 years believing myself content with solitude, convinced that avoiding connection was safer than risking the kind of failure I caused before. You have taught me, these past months, that I was simply hiding, not healing." He took her hands gently in his. "I do not wish to hide any longer." They stood together in the winter garden, the cold forgotten between them, and Alina felt, for the first time in 6 years, entirely and completely certain of something she had once believed she would never allow herself to trust again. He did not propose that day, though the moment carried all the weight of one. Instead, he simply held her hands and told her, with the same plain honesty that had drawn her to him from the very beginning, that he intended to court her properly, publicly, without hesitation or hiding, and that when he finally did ask the question every soul in London expected him to ask, he wished for her to know beyond any doubt that his answer would be built on nothing but truth. Their return to London brought with it an entirely new wave of speculation. The reclusive Duke of Marchbrook, courting openly, attending balls and dinners he had avoided for years, always at Alina Ashworth's side. The whispers that had once painted her as difficult and strange now shifted into something entirely different, tinged with the particular fascination society reserved for a story too romantic to resist repeating. Alina found she no longer minded the attention nearly as much as she once had. It was easier to endure whispers when the truth beneath them was something she was genuinely proud of, rather than something she felt forced to defend. But not everyone in London greeted the match with delight, and it was not long before the first real threat to their happiness arrived, wearing the polished, dangerous smile of someone who had every intention of ensuring the Duke chose a very different bride entirely. Her name was Lady Constance Whitfield, and she arrived back in London society with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told no in her life. Alina first encountered her at a ball hosted by the Marquis of Ellsworth, barely a week after she and the Duke had returned from Marchbrook. Lady Constance approached with a smile so perfectly composed it might have been painted on, her eyes moving over Alina with a swift, assessing glance that reminded her uncomfortably of a merchant evaluating goods before making an offer. "Lady Alina," Constance said, her voice smooth as polished glass, "I have heard so much about you, The whole of London speaks of little else. I hope only kind things, Lady Constance. Mostly, her smile did not waver. Though I confess I find myself curious. The Duke of Marchbrook has been such a careful man for so many years. It seems rather sudden, does it not, that he should abandon that caution so completely, and for someone with such a colorful history of refused proposals. Alina recognized the barb beneath the pleasant tone immediately, though she kept her own expression carefully neutral. I imagine sudden change can be alarming to those accustomed to a person's habits, Lady Constance. I find it rather less alarming when the change is built on genuine understanding rather than mere convenience. Something flickered behind Constance's composed features, a brief crack in the polish, before her smile returned, sharper now. How wise you sound, for someone with so little experience in matters of the ton. I have known Alastair since childhood, you understand. Our families have long expected an eventual match between us. It has simply taken him rather longer than anyone anticipated to come to his senses. The claim landed with more weight than Alina wished to admit, a small, cold seed of doubt planted despite her best efforts to dismiss it. She had never asked the Duke about his family's expectations, had never considered that his own relations might have long assumed a particular future for him, one that did not include her. She said nothing further to Lady Constance that evening, though the conversation lingered uncomfortably in her thoughts for days afterward, resurfacing at inconvenient moments, whispering doubts she had believed herself finally free of. It was nearly 2 weeks later, at a dinner hosted by the Duke's own aunt, that the true weight of the challenge became clear. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, made little effort to hide her preference for Lady Constance throughout the evening, praising her lineage, her accomplishments, her long familiarity with the family's expectations, in pointed contrast to the careful but noticeably less enthusiastic pleasantries she offered Alina. "You must understand," the Dowager Duchess said to Alina privately, once the gentleman had withdrawn after dinner, "that a duke's marriage is not simply a matter of personal affection. It is a matter of legacy, of alliance, of ensuring the family's position remains secure for generations to come. Lady Constance brings considerable advantages to such a union. I wonder, quite honestly, what advantages you believe you bring beyond a pretty face and a stubborn reputation." The words stung far more than Alina wished to admit, striking directly at every insecurity she had carried since her first season, every whisper that had ever called her difficult, strange, unsuitable. "I bring honesty, your grace," Alina said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building beneath it, "and genuine regard for your nephew, rather than calculated advantage. I understand that may carry less weight in circles concerned primarily with legacy, but I believe it carries considerably more weight with Alastair himself." The Dowager Duchess studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, her expression unreadable, before turning away without further comment, leaving Alina alone with a growing, unwelcome uncertainty that followed her home that night, and refused to fully release its grip in the days that followed. The Duke noticed the shift in her almost immediately, though it took several visits before Alina found the courage to explain what had happened. When she finally did, recounting both Lady Constance's pointed remarks and his aunt's cold assessment, she watched carefully for his reaction, half fearing some confirmation of the doubts that had been growing steadily within her. Instead, something like quiet anger crossed his features, controlled but unmistakable. "My aunt has always believed Constance the more suitable match," he admitted, "though I have told her plainly, on more than one occasion, that suitability by her measure has never been my priority. As for the notion of any long-standing understanding between myself and Constance, I assure you it exists nowhere, but in my aunt's imagination and Constance's considerable ambition." "She seemed rather certain," Alina said quietly. "Constance has always been certain of a great many things that were never actually true," the Duke said, something firm and unwavering in his voice. "I will not pretend my family holds no expectations regarding my marriage, Alina, but I have spent 5 years disappointing those expectations by remaining unmarried entirely, and I find I have grown quite comfortable disappointing them further, if it means choosing honestly rather than conveniently. Despite the reassurance, the following weeks brought a steady, exhausting campaign of subtle pressure. Invitations arrived that pointedly excluded Alina while including Lady Constance. Whispers grew louder, suggesting the Duke's affections were merely a passing infatuation destined to fade once true family obligation reasserted itself. Alina found herself, more than once, lying awake at night wondering whether she was fighting a battle she could not ultimately win, whether love built on honesty could truly withstand the combined weight of legacy, expectation, and a rival who refused to accept defeat gracefully. The breaking point arrived at a ball hosted by the Dowager Duchess herself, an event Alina suspected had been designed, at least in part, as a final opportunity to showcase Lady Constance's superior suitability before the assembled ton. Lady Constance approached her early in the evening, her composed smile firmly in place, though something sharper glinted beneath it now. "I understand you have been struggling rather considerably with the family's expectations, Lady Alina," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of guests nearby. "It must be difficult, marrying into a position you were never truly prepared for. I do hope, for your own sake, that you consider stepping aside gracefully, before the humiliation becomes considerably more public than a single refused proposal ever was." The threat, thinly veiled beneath polite concern, landed exactly as intended, and Alina felt the old fear rise sharply within her, the familiar dread of public humiliation that had followed her since Lord Finch's ballroom proposal months earlier. But beneath the fear, something else stirred as well. A clarity born from every honest conversation she had shared with the Duke since that first quiet garden, every moment he had asked her opinion, valued her judgment, treated her not as a prize to be won or lost, but as a person whose choices genuinely mattered. "I appreciate your concern, Lady Constance," Alina said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "But I have spent this entire season learning that public humiliation is far less frightening than a private life built on dishonesty. I do not intend to step aside from something genuine simply because it might prove socially inconvenient for you." Constance's composed mask slipped fully then, anger flashing plainly across her features before she caught herself, forcing the smile back into place. "You will regret this, Lady Alina. The Duke's family will never fully accept you, no matter how convincingly he plays the devoted suitor tonight." "Perhaps," Alina said quietly, "but I would rather be imperfectly accepted while being honestly loved than perfectly accepted while being quietly unhappy. I understand that may be a difficult distinction for you to appreciate, Lady Constance, but I have learned it rather thoroughly this past year." She walked away before Constance could respond further, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward composure, and it was only once she reached the relative privacy of a nearby alcove that she allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what had just occurred. The Duke found her there minutes later, having witnessed the tail end of the confrontation from across the room, his expression a mixture of concern and something fiercer, something protective that Alina had not seen from him before. "I heard what she said to you," he said, taking her hands gently. "I am sorry, Alina. I should have addressed my aunt's expectations, and Constance's ambitions, far more directly, far sooner than I did." "I do not need you to fight my battles for me, Alistair," Alina said, though she squeezed his hands gratefully. "I need only to know that you stand beside me while I fight them myself." Something fierce and tender crossed his expression, and he lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers with a reverence that left no room for doubt. "Then let all of London witness exactly where I stand," he said quietly, "starting tonight." He led her back into the ballroom, her hand held firmly in his, and made no effort to hide the depth of his regard as they moved together through the crowd, past his aunt's pointed disapproval, past Constance's furious, disbelieving stare, until every guest present understood, without a single word needing to be spoken, exactly which woman the Duke of Marchbrook had chosen. It was not the end of every challenge they would face. His aunt's disapproval would take considerably longer to soften, and Constance's wounded pride would linger in bitter whispers for weeks afterward. But standing together in the center of that ballroom, Alina felt, for the first time since her 17th year, entirely certain that whatever came next, she would not face it alone, nor would she face it hidden behind performance and pretense. She had found, finally, exactly what she had once believed impossible: a love built entirely on honesty, strong enough to withstand every test London could offer. Spring arrived early that year, softening the harsh edges of a London winter that had felt, at times, as though it might never fully release its grip. Alina stood at her bedroom window, watching the first green buds appear on the trees lining the street below, and felt a similar softening within her own chest, the last remnants of old fear finally beginning to loosen their hold. The weeks following the ball at the Dowager Duchess's townhouse had not been without difficulty. Lady Constance had retreated from London society for a time, her pride too wounded to endure the whispers that had turned decisively against her following her public confrontation with Alina. The Dowager Duchess herself had remained cool for several weeks longer, though even her considerable resistance had begun, slowly, to thaw beneath the persistent evidence of her nephew's genuine happiness. It was a visit to Marchbrook's tenant families, 3 weeks after the ball, that finally shifted something in the Dowager Duchess's opinion entirely. She had accompanied them north, ostensibly to inspect the estate's winter repairs, though Alina suspected the true purpose was to observe her more closely, away from the performative pressures of London society. She had watched Alina kneel beside an elderly tenant's bed, listening patiently to the woman's concerns about her grandson's upcoming apprenticeship, offering practical suggestions drawn from careful thought rather than empty sympathy. She had watched Alina discuss crop rotations with the estate steward with genuine understanding, the same understanding that had once saved the tenants from a costly and poorly considered agricultural change. She had watched, over the course of several days, a young woman who cared genuinely for the responsibilities that came with the title she might one day hold, rather than simply the privileges. "I confess," the Dowager Duchess said, on their final evening at Marchbrook, finding Alina alone in the library, "that I misjudged you rather severely, Lady Alina. I believed Constance's advantages of birth and long acquaintance outweighed whatever genuine affection my nephew held for you. I see now that I was measuring the wrong qualities entirely." "I appreciate your honesty, Your Grace," Alina said carefully, still uncertain of the older woman's full intentions. "Alastair has been a different man since he began courting you," the Dowager continued. "For 5 years I watched him retreat further and further into solitude, and I convinced myself it was simply his nature, that the boy who once laughed easily and trusted freely had been permanently lost after his broken engagement. I was wrong about that as well." She studied Alina carefully. "You have given him back something I feared he had lost forever. I owe you an apology, and considerably more gratitude than I have shown you thus far." The reconciliation, once begun, proved genuine and lasting, and by the time they returned to London in early spring, the Dowager Duchess had become, somewhat unexpectedly, one of Alina's most vocal supporters, her sharp opinions now employed firmly in Alina's defense against any lingering whispers of doubt. It was on a clear morning in April, in the very garden where their private conversations had first begun months earlier, that the Duke finally asked the question all of London had been anticipating since the night he had first walked openly through Lady Pembroke's garden party at Alina's side. He had invited her to Marchbrook once more, this time accompanied only by her parents rather than the larger visiting party of previous months, and had asked to walk with her alone through the same winter garden where she had first spoken the truth of what she wanted from her future. The garden had transformed considerably since that cold winter walk. New growth softened every bare branch, early blooms scattered color across beds that had once seemed stark and gray, and the entire space seemed, to Alina, to mirror precisely the transformation that had occurred within herself over the preceding months. "I have asked you a great many questions since the night we first spoke in this garden," the Duke said, stopping at the same stone bench where they had once stood together beneath a bare autumn tree. I asked what troubled you about my steward's numbers. I asked what you truly wanted from your future. Each time, your answers taught me something I had not known I needed to learn. Elinor watched him carefully, her heart beginning to quicken as she recognized, with growing certainty, exactly what was coming. I find I have one final question, the Duke continued, and to Elinor's quiet astonishment, he lowered himself onto one knee before her, something she had genuinely believed, given his consistent avoidance of performance and grand gesture, he might never do. Not the question London expects, though I suppose it amounts to the same thing in the end. I do not wish to simply ask whether you will marry me, Elinor, as though marriage itself were the only thing that mattered. He took her hand gently in his eyes steady and open in a way that held nothing back. I wish to ask whether you will choose this, he said quietly. Whether you will choose me, not because it is expected, not because it would silence every whisper that has ever followed you through a London ballroom, not even because I am a duke and you have grown weary of refusing suitors. I am asking whether you will choose this life, this partnership, this particular imperfect, entirely honest future, simply because you want it, for its own sake, as fully and freely as I want it with you. Tears gathered in Elinor's eyes, warm and unhidden, and she found, standing in that garden where everything between them had truly begun, that she had never felt more certain of anything in her entire life. I choose this, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. I choose you, Alistair, not because London expects it, not because it silences any whisper, but because you are the first person who has ever truly asked me what I wanted, and then waited with genuine patience for me to discover the honest answer. I do not want performance. I do not want convenience. I want exactly this, exactly you, for no reason beyond the simple truth that I love you, entirely and freely. The Duke rose, drawing her into an embrace that held none of the careful restraint he had maintained throughout their courtship. And Elinor felt, held securely against him beneath the blooming spring garden, that she had finally found everything 6 years of careful refusal had been quietly protecting, waiting patiently to discover. Their wedding took place 2 months later, in early summer, at a small country church near Marchbrook, rather than the grand London Cathedral Society had expected. It was, in keeping with everything that had brought them together, an entirely honest affair, small and warm rather than performed for spectacle, attended by tenants and family alike rather than simply those whose presence would generate the most favorable gossip. Elinor's mother wept openly throughout the ceremony, her earlier anxieties long since replaced by genuine, overwhelming joy. Her father stood proudly beside her, and as he walked her down the short aisle toward the altar where Alistair waited, he leaned close and whispered words she would carry with her for the rest of her life. I told you once that a wrong marriage is a far heavier burden than a late one, he said quietly. I am prouder than I can express, Elinor, that you waited for the right one instead. As Elinor exchanged vows with the man who had asked the one question no other suitor had ever thought to ask, she felt, standing in the warm summer light of that small country church, the full weight of everything the past year had taught her. That honesty, patiently offered and patiently received, was worth infinitely more than any amount of practiced charm. That refusing every prospect that offered less than genuine regard had not been recklessness, as her mother once feared, but simple, necessary wisdom. That sometimes the right person arrives not with the loudest declaration, but with the quietest, most sincere question, offered simply because they genuinely wished to know the answer. London, true to its nature, continued talking for months afterward, though the story had shifted entirely from scandal into legend. The tale of the woman who had refused every prospect in the city, until one duke had finally asked the only question that had ever truly mattered. And Elinor, standing beside her husband as they greeted their small gathering of genuine well-wishers beneath the summer sun, found she did not mind the talking nearly as much as she once had. Let London tell the story however it wished. She knew the truth of it, carried quietly and certainly in her own heart, and that, she had finally learned, was worth infinitely more than any reputation she might have protected by choosing safety over honesty all those refused proposals ago. A year after the wedding, Marchbrook looked different in ways that had nothing to do with the seasons changing. The house still carried its quiet gray stone and wild climbing ivy, but the rooms themselves felt warmer now, filled more often with laughter, with visiting tenant families welcomed through the front door rather than kept at a polite distance, with the easy, unguarded conversation that had once seemed impossible for a duke who had spent 5 years avoiding connection entirely. Elinor had settled into her role not as a distant mistress of the house, but as an active partner in every decision that shaped it. She reviewed estate matters alongside Alastair rather than simply hearing of them afterward, her early instinct about the tenant farms having proven so valuable that he had come to trust her judgment on a dozen matters since. From decisions about school funding for tenant children, to a new arrangement with a nearby market town that had strengthened the estate's finances considerably. Her mother, once so anxious about Elinor's refusals, now spoke of her daughter's marriage to anyone who would listen, holding it up as proof that patience, however difficult, could yield exactly the outcome a mother hoped for. The Countess visited Marchbrook often, her relationship with Elinor easier now than it had been throughout the tense years of London seasons, the two women having found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, genuine friendship once the pressure of finding a match had finally lifted. The Dowager Duchess, once so firmly in Lady Constance's corner, had become one of Elinor's closest confidants within the family, the two women exchanging letters weekly, the older woman offering guidance not as a critic assessing suitability, but as someone who had come to love Elinor genuinely, for exactly who she was rather than what advantages she brought to the family name. Lady Constance herself had eventually married a wealthy baron from Yorkshire, a match that satisfied every requirement of legacy and advantage she had once believed essential, though whispers occasionally reached Elinor suggesting the marriage carried little of the warmth she and Alastair shared. Elinor found she felt no satisfaction in those whispers, only a quiet, genuine hope that Constance might one day find, in her own way, the same honest happiness Elinor had discovered. Edmund Carow had married as well, a quiet match with a widow from Sussex, and Elinor heard, through distant acquaintances, that he seemed content, his earlier restlessness finally settled. She held no lingering resentment toward him. If anything, she felt a strange, distant gratitude, understanding now that the pain he had once caused her had shaped the careful wisdom that eventually led her to recognize genuine honesty when it finally arrived. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, exactly 1 year after their garden proposal, that Alastair found Elinor in the same library where his aunt had once offered her genuine apology, seated near the window with a stack of correspondence from the estate's tenant families spread across her desk. "You are working rather late," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "There is a dispute between two tenant families regarding a shared boundary fence," Elinor said, not looking up from the letter in her hands. "I believe I have found a fair resolution, though I wish to review the original agreement once more before proposing it." Alastair watched her for a long moment, something warm and deeply content in his expression. "Do you remember the very first question I ever asked you, about the tenant farms and the crop rotation?" Elinor looked up, smiling at the memory. "I remember thinking it was the strangest thing any suitor had ever asked me. No one had ever wanted my opinion on anything of actual consequence. I remember thinking in that moment that I had finally found someone who saw the estate the way I did, not simply as land and income, but as people whose lives depended on the decisions made about it." He reached across the desk and took her hand gently. "I did not know then how much further that would carry us." "Nor did I," Elinor admitted. "I only knew that for the first time someone had asked a question because they genuinely wished to know my answer, not because they wished to hear themselves praised for asking it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the tenant dispute letters forgotten momentarily between them. Elinor thought back, as she often did during quiet moments like this, to the ballroom where it had all begun, to the shocked silence following her refusal of Lord Finch, to the whispers that had painted her as difficult, strange, unmarriageable. She thought of every suitor who had complimented her eyes without once asking what she thought, every polite conversation that had circled endlessly around expectation without ever touching genuine curiosity. And she thought, with quiet gratitude, of the moment a reclusive duke had asked her, simply and honestly, what she actually wanted, separate from every voice that had ever told her otherwise. London had spent a full season calling her the girl who says no, as though refusal itself were a flaw rather than simple honesty. She understood now, a year into a marriage built on exactly the honesty she had once been mocked for demanding, that every refusal had simply been her own quiet insistence on waiting for a question worth answering truthfully. She had found that question, finally, in a cold garden beneath a bare autumn tree, offered by a man unwilling to perform affection he did not genuinely feel. And in choosing her answer freely, without pressure, without performance, without the weight of anyone else's expectations pressing against her own genuine desire, Elinor had found not simply a husband, but a partnership built to last far longer than any fleeting London gossip, rooted in something far steadier than charm. The simple, uncommon gift of being truly, honestly known. Outside the library window, the autumn evening settled softly over Marchbrook's gardens, the same gardens where their story had quietly begun, and Elinor, resting comfortably beside the man who had asked the one question no other suitor ever had, found herself entirely, peacefully certain that she had chosen exactly right.